See, sometimes they use words that I don't get. He said, that was a condenser, and I'm thinking, does that mean it drips water? Have to worry about something? And again, it's always when I'm doing this, little medieval torture humor, sorry, that, we've got to do extra things whenever I talk, the setting up, the transition, the making sure this is high enough up so that I don't start leaning over, otherwise Mary complains about my posture. This morning I decided, well, I'd like a folding chair as opposed to one of the heavier standard ones like we now have in the kitchen. And again, a little medieval humor here. So I glanced around and remembered, oh yeah, we don't keep the folding chairs there anymore. Where did they go? Mary walked by. I said, Mary, the folding chairs, where are they next? And she said, well, they're in the next room on the rack. And I thought, that's right, we haven't had a heretic in a while. We had to repurpose the need for the rack. So at that point, I thought, okay, it's going to be a good day. Let's see, Sean, do we have that first slide up there of context? Okay. And I'll just, Brad, are you, yeah, y'all got it. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And in a lot of ways, it's what we've asked Adam to talk about over the last few months, quite frankly. That what I am discovering is that one of the toughest things about reading the Bible is understanding context. That it completely changes everything from what I originally thought it was as a youngster growing up, and you hear the Bible stories and all that kind of thing. But as you get older, and as you really start to try and figure out who God is and what we're supposed to be doing, suddenly context begins to come into play. Sean, the next one. And it's very quick in that these days, and for the last 400 years or so, the world has been very lucky in that we've been able to start printing Bibles. That, we have to remember that for 1,500 years, Bibles were all handwritten. That you depended upon some group of folks who sit in a room and either have somebody read while they write, or they're looking at a copy. And I don't know how y'all did in school, but the idea of looking back and forth between a book and trying to copy, there's all sorts of chances of making an error and getting lost or falling asleep or whatever, and not getting as many pages done as I should have that day. Bibles were precious. Now, there's some amount of negative that comes with that when we begin to see a Bible printed in our own language. Now, the positives far outweigh the negatives of every nation, every language having a Bible in their own language. The positives are just so much better, but it sets you up for some traps. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about this morning. That one of the things when you begin to put together your theology of what you think the Bible is saying, and as you look at these stories and how they fit together, and you look at how it describes God, and you try and understand God's nature, we take those words that, let's see, Sean, go ahead and move it to the next one. We take those words, and one of the main things that we need to look for is consistency. That God does not change. Had a buddy that we used to study with, and he had a very different background than mine. He, because of the way he'd grown up and because of things he was exposed to, had a very strong sense that he just had a hard time reconciling that the God of the Old Testament was the same as the God of the New Testament. I don't, because my cultural background and some things are very different. I can see, and I'm lucky to have been raised in a family that taught me how you can read through both Old and New Testament, and it's the same God, that he fundamentally hasn't changed. Now, there are parts and aspects of his nature that become stronger as time goes on, and as the New Testament comes into play. Um, yeah, I've got a new buzz. Sorry. And so you wind up with, y'all, sometimes it's a struggle. Now, I enjoy doing jigsaw puzzles. I find them entertaining, they're challenging. The more pieces, the better. I've got one grandchild that she only does 300-piece puzzles. Now, she likes to do them very quickly, and they're done, and she gets it out of the way. I don't. I'm like, come on, let's go to a 750. Let's go to a 1,000-piece. Come on. No way. She doesn't touch it. But I enjoy them. But there's a problem when I tackle those big puzzles like that. The guys that cut them out are mean. That they will use the same identical shape for a couple of pieces that are real close in their color scheme. And so I wind up getting to the end of that puzzle, and I've got one piece left over. And, all the time I'm putting the puzzle together, there are times where I have to take entire sections and go, oh, this isn't part of the tree. This is part of the shrubbery out in front of the house. And you have to pick it up and move it over. And you get to the end, and I've got one hole left, and I've got one puzzle piece left, and they fit, but the colors don't match. They were close, but it is very clear to me, and at that point, it takes another 5 or 10 minutes because now I have to scour the rest of the puzzle that had those colors that were real close to it in order to figure out which one did I put in the wrong place. And you find it, and you pull it out, and you put it in somewhere else, and I take that one leftover piece that I had, and I put it in. And now I have the picture that matches what was on the box, and it makes much more sense. One of the greatest problems that we have, maybe with any religion, I know it happens with Christianity, and that is, as we study and as we look at it, since we're human beings and we have biases and we have backgrounds and we have a history and we read things a certain way, the greatest reason that we have denominational differences and differences even within a congregation is the way we put those puzzle pieces together. That they read this verse as meaning this, they read this verse as meaning this, and so they assemble the puzzle and how they think God's nature is. That's part of the puzzle. What we're supposed to be doing as a church is another part of that puzzle. What I do as an individual and what I should be believing is another part of that puzzle. And so what happens is we tend to put pieces in the wrong place. And so one of those things that is a lifelong study for every one of us, and I know it, is we have to reread and rethink sometimes, where does this piece go? And how does that fit into this whole thing? Now, historically, there are some things that, let's see, Sean, are we on about slide 4? And when I printed out my notes and things this morning, I made sure that I printed it just below what I have the ability to read. So, getting it closer to my eyes. When you look at things and you wonder about context, one of the things we've been talking with Adam and have asked, and so there have been a couple of sermons a month or so ago where 1 Corinthians, we have stood on certain interpretations of chapter 14 for a long time, for decades. There's a problem, though, in that when you look at chapter 12, it blows apart our interpretation sometimes of 14. And the issue there is when you have the same writer writing to the same church in the same book, that particular letter. I'm not getting mixed up between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians because there could be some changes that are going on. But when you're looking within the same book, there ought to be consistency in what the person had in mind as he's inspired and he writes that lesson. And if you wind up with a disconnect, the problem's probably on you or on us. in that there's not going to be a disconnect in the writer in the way that he's put that out. And so the variation between chapter 12 and 14 is significant, and we've got to go back and reconcile that. Another one that's come up is Ephesians chapter 2, the issue of being saved by grace. 2 chapters later, all at once baptism comes into play, which a lot of folks go, no, that falls under works. And the truth of the matter is, that is the only sacrament that's mentioned in chapter 4 where it talks about the fact that we have one God, one baptism, one, and he names some other things that are more esoteric in there. And so you've got to be able to reconcile that, because when Paul wrote Ephesians, he's not schizophrenic and thinking one direction one time and something else the other time. Your theology has to be such that that goes through and makes sense. The readings in Timothy chapter 3 about the wives, real easy to get confused as you read through there. James chapter 2, the sarcasm, it drips with sarcasm. And what's funny to me is most of the time we misread it. We forget that these are human beings trying to get a point across, and we miss the sarcasm, and so we wind up quoting that as reality. It's nearly like walking into your history test and using Monty Python and the Holy Grail as your basis for answering Middle English history questions. It doesn't work. They didn't walk around clomping with coconut halves trying to make horse sounds. But that's the kind of thing that we wind up doing. Those are all tough. I'm not going to tackle them today. But I am going to jump to ones that I think are maybe easier, and we'll get through the day with. So, Sean, on slide 5, Jesus in the garden. And we're going to be looking at the garden and the cross kind of statements this morning. That when Jesus is in that garden, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the only ones really to describe and tell us about that time in Gethsemane. John goes straight from the Last Supper, goes to the garden, Jesus gets arrested. There's not that prayer that's there. Now, and I'm going to rely a great deal on your memory and your understanding, because y'all are a pretty good group who've looked at these stories and things. And you know that all three of those synoptic gospels, they tell the story a little bit differently, but in every one of them, there is a very emotional Jesus whose, blood is mixing with his sweat. He's very he's wrenching. He's looking to God saying, God, if there is another way, I'd like to go that direction. But at the end, in every one of those three gospel writers' renditions of what goes on in that garden, Jesus ends with the same kind of a phrase of not my will, but your will be done. And so what I get from that is those statements are showing a great deal of resolve. He's resolute in what he knows is about to happen. He's resolute in knowing that he's going to death, and he's okay with it. He's going to follow the plan that he and God have talked about for millennia. He's going to go ahead and go through with it. There is a kind of a biting your bottom lip, stiff upper lip. He's going to go do it. He then steps out into the garden and is arrested. Now, you then wind up with the trials and the the final sentences of him going to the cross. And so now, let's see, Sean, about slide 6. So on the cross, I'm going to start with the last two writers, Luke and John. Again, we've got the 4 Gospels, but they all kind of have a different personality and perspective on what's going on, and they have different readers that they're trying to reach. John writes his at the end of, nearly the end of the first century. He's had many years to look at what the other Gospels have said. And so John kind of tells a different gospel because he's kind of batting cleanup. That again, in old baseball lineups, the fourth batter you called batting cleanup because you always hoped that 1, 2, and 3 got on base, and then fourth batter was the one that could really knock the ball out of the park, and you had a better chance of scoring more runs that way. And so John comes along, and he's writing things a little bit different. So let's take a look first here at Luke, and then we'll look at what John says. Luke has 3 statements that Jesus makes from the cross. The first one is, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. A great deal of compassion that Jesus has as he looks upon that crowd and as he feels the pain that he's enduring. He has enough presence of mind that he looks and he talks to God because he and God are one. And he says, God, forgive these people for what they're doing. The fact that they have hit me, the fact that they have whipped me, the fact that they have me hanging on this cross and are about to execute me. He has a very strong presence of mind. He has a very strong relationship with God. And what are his thoughts? His thoughts are not of himself, but of the people that have put him there and are watching him die. God, forgive them. 2 other men were crucified with Jesus that day, and we know that story. One of them continues to mock Jesus. The other takes issue and explains to the other fella, look, we deserve to be here. This guy doesn't. Had he heard Jesus ahead of time? Did he know who Jesus was and what he taught? There's a backstory there that we don't have, but what we do know is he, while hanging on a cross, took up for Jesus, and Jesus has enough presence of mind that he looks over at him as well as he can, and he says, truly I tell you, you will be with me in paradise. Now, there's a hint there also of something. Where is Jesus about to go to also? According to that sentence, paradise. So you wind up with him saying, you're going to join me. Your death here is not in vain. You're going to be with me from this point forward in paradise. Crucifixion is primarily not a bleeding out of death. It's not being hanged by your neck where it snaps and you're gone. It's not a guillotine where suddenly your head gets separated from the rest of your body, or an axe. It's a very slow, painful death by suffocation. And so you hang on a cross for hours before you finally can't hold yourself up anymore to take a breath, and you wind up expiring. And towards the end of that, as Luke writes his 3rd statement that Jesus makes from the cross, it's, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Again, a very resolute, matter-of-fact statement that Jesus makes according to Luke. Now, John, who was there, when he finally, decades later, writes his gospel, batting cleanup, he also has 3 statements that Jesus makes from the cross. And the first one deals with something that's very personal to him, because Jesus looks down at his mother who's there near the cross, and he can see her, and they can hear him. And it's early on in that process of dying while he still has enough air to speak, and he looks at his mom, and he has her look at John, and he goes, woman, behold thy son. Saying, Mom, John's going to look after you from here on out because I'm not going to be around to do that anymore. And to John, he looks at him and he says, behold your mother. So here he is, hanging from the cross, and his presence of mind is to think in terms of making sure that his mom is cared for, that he still has generosity overflowing within him. Under Luke, praying for people to be forgiven. There on the cross, he's letting his mom and John know that they're going to have a relationship now for the decades to come, because John is going to be looking after her. There's a point towards the end where he finally says, I'm thirsty. It's a death where he's been hanging up on that cross, struggling to breathe. His mouth is dry. His tongue is swollen. And he finally breaks down and says, I'm thirsty. Can I have something to drink? At which point they stick old wine, vinegar is what old wine is, on a stick and given to him. And that's actually a quote that comes out of Psalm 69, that's going to happen to the Messiah. But at that point, he's ready to expire. And so it simply says in John's language, again, John, first person who's there, who's watching Jesus die, he says, it is finished. Again, a very resolute, he has his wits about him. He's not gone crazy from the hunger or thirst. Again, a God who is in control, a person who is in control of his death as he dies, and he says it's finished. Matthew and Mark are different. So again, Sean, next slide. Matthew and Mark, Mark historically we take is written first. Luke and Matthew borrow heavily at points from Mark as they write their stories and their narrative, because Mark doesn't have a lot of Jesus said kind of stuff. He has some. But so you can find most of Mark if you scour the pages of Matthew and Luke. In this particular case, the scene on the cross, Matthew and Mark are nearly verbatim. Now, Matthew and Mark have a specific group of people in mind as they write. I'm going to remind you about Mark's history. Mark, I believe, was there in the garden when Jesus was arrested, because one of the variations in the book of Mark is the scene in Gethsemane. As Jesus is arrested, there's an extra story that doesn't have anything to do with Jesus and his arrest that's thrown in, just a couple of verses. And I think those are Mark referencing himself. And so, because it doesn't fit with the story of what's going on. So I think Mark was there and actually watched Jesus getting arrested. When Peter's thrown in prison and an angel comes and releases him from prison, Peter knows, I need to go check on the Christians that are here in Jerusalem. And he has word that the Christians are praying for him. And where are they? They're at John Mark's mother's house. So John Mark is from Jerusalem. And so Peter goes over there, and it's a funny story, because the lady who answers the door thinks it's a ghost, because Peter must have died in prison. But anyway, my point is, John, I think, is there in the garden. John's family are early Christians here in Jerusalem, playing a big role in what all's going on. Barnabas and Paul are up in, it'll come to me a little bit later, one of those moments of, and the Holy Spirit comes to him, Antioch, sorry. And the Holy Spirit comes to him and says, hey, I want you to set apart Barnabas and Paul, because I'm ready for them to start their work. And the reason Paul had been, that Jesus himself spoke to Paul after his death and has Paul brought in, because Paul has been commissioned that he's going to go out and preach to the Gentiles. He's going to be the primary apostle that brings in and expands Christianity beyond just the Jews, but to bring in the Gentiles and figure out that reconciliation, how everybody comes in together. And so most of Paul's letters deal with the fact that that's his commission. And he and Barnabas take off, and they go on that first missionary journey. And there's some neat things that happen, and they go to Cyprus, they go across Asia Minor, what we now know as Turkey, and they come on back home. And they're back home for a little bit, and they look at each other and they say, you know what? We probably ought to go check on those folks. Now, John Mark had started with them on that first trip. Pretty early into it, he picks up and goes home. No discussion about the backstory of what happened, such that Mark wanted to go home. Everybody has different opinions. I'm one of those that lines up with the idea that Mark, being so very Jewish, was kind of having a hard time with what he was hearing Paul preach about the folks, the Jews, the Gentiles that were coming into church, not having to first become Jews. They got to come straight directly in and be able to be full-fledged Christians without going through a process of becoming a Jew first. Whatever it is, Mark had taken off and gone home. Barnabas looks at Paul as they get ready to make this second trip. Barnabas says, well, I've got John Mark lined up to come with us this time again. And Paul says, there's no way. Acts 15 is one of the most heart-wrenching early stories that I know of in Acts. Because these two great men who have done marvelous things and had miracles, and they have witnessed miracles, they have performed miracles, they have reached out to the Gentiles, they have begun expanding the church into the outer regions of eastern side of the Mediterranean. It's now going on into Turkey, and Barnabas and Paul have a fight. They cannot resolve it. They are so split over whether John Mark can come with them or not that they finally decide, you know what? You go one way, I'm going the other. So Barnabas takes John Mark and he heads off to Cyprus. Paul picks up Silas and goes back to check on the churches. It's a very sad story. John Mark was in the middle of it. In some ways, he's the cause of Barnabas and Paul breaking and going different directions and not speaking to each other. Sad story. Something happened in the intervening years. We don't know what. Again, there's not enough backstory. But in 2 Timothy, Paul's writing to Timothy, and towards the end, chapter 3, he goes, oh yeah, and bring John Mark. He's a great worker for the Lord. We need him for the work that we're trying to do. So the writer Mark has this interesting story in his background. And when he sits there and writes what we consider to be the first of the Gospels, he's writing because of his culture to a very Jewish audience. Matthew, absolutely without question, is writing to a Jewish audience. Now, is Matthew is he writing to people trying to convince them to become a Christian? Yeah, I think that's in there. Is he writing to help them see that God followed his pattern and met the prophecies that he had in the Old Testament about Jesus coming along? Yeah, that's in there. Is Matthew maybe trying to get Jews to hang on to Christianity that they've been converted to? Because They've done it for a while. Jesus hasn't returned yet. Culturally, they're so used to doing things in their Jewish way that do they need some encouragement to hang in there, because there is a new way of doing things. They don't have to fall back into Judaism. And so Matthew and Mark both are writing very, very Jewish books to talk about Jesus and explain who he is. Lots of references to the Old Testament. Now here's what's interesting. Let's see, slide 8. Each one of those, again, since they're verbatim, they only make one statement of Jesus being on the cross. None of this conversation about, John, watch after my mom. None of this praying or it is finished. They make one statement. Both of those writers is how they handle that death on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, because that's English and we read it, the most prevalent discussion of that statement is it deals with the separation that Jesus is feeling from God. The fact that he's got this death, that he's the Lamb of God, he's the sacrifice. We focus on the fact that Jesus is in despair. Now, here's my problem with that. It's a puzzle piece that doesn't fit. That here on these other two Gospels, I've got 6 statements from the cross that are either resolute, very positive, showing a great deal of coherence, showing a great deal of control in where he is and what he's doing. And now suddenly, these two Gospels sum it up with just one word that is one set phrase that's very depressing, shows somebody who's nearly given up, a feeling of being forsaken from God. There's a problem with that, isn't there? Let's see, Sean, on slide 9, that the tone doesn't match what the other Gospels say. Our interpretation and our read and our understanding as we look at the English, sermons that I've heard all my life, when you look up nowadays on the internet for folks to interpret and give kind of a commentary on what's going on, they nearly always knee-jerk to this idea and they begin to try and explain it as this separation from God and this horrible depression that Jesus is in at that point on the cross. And as far as I'm concerned, they miss the point, because that is absolutely inconsistent with what I see in the other two Gospels about what goes on the cross. Let's see. Sean, the next slide. Yeah. A lot of heavy stuff. We're just going to take a break for a few minutes. It's a lot going on. Last time I was up here, we did 1 Peter. Tried to memorize a couple of verses in there, because memorization is important. So we're going to take a break, and kind of, in that I want your minds to go back to different thought. We're just going to change thoughts here. I'm going to let your subconscious work on what we've been talking about so far. All right, I'm going to start with what I hope and think is going to be a familiar set of verses to you. And I want you to help me finish them on each sentence. See if we can get there. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall want. He leads me to green pastures. He leads me beside still. He restores my. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Y'all did that well. And yes, there's a point to that. That is a great question, and the answer probably should have been yes. Because for a lot of years, that has been the reward for saying your memory verse and getting it right. And in fact, I didn't take us all the way through because I, up there at this moment, probably can't get all the way through it. And therefore, I would get to go get ice cream. So if I can't go, no, nobody goes. Here's the point of that. Sean, slide number 11. In both of these Gospels, they do not jump to the phrase about, oh God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Both of these writers make it very complicated. They are writing these books in Greek, but here's what they do. And it's the only time two writers ever do this. They jump in to an Aramaic phrase. And so, frankly, that verse starts out with Jesus hanging on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And then they write, and this means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because they're having to explain this to readers who aren't Jewish. They know that others are going to see the writings in their gospel. And so they sit there, both of them, and they write it in Aramaic, and then they have to give a translation. And so as they're writing it, they write it such that a person is reading the Aramaic. I'm sure they didn't use Aramaic letters. I'm sure they had to write it in Greek phonetically. And then they explained it in Greek, that it means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Makes it very complicated as far as translation and as far as what they were writing. Why in the world would they go to such trouble to throw in an Aramaic phrase and then have to give a translation? I'll tell you why. Sean, that next slide. Because in the same way that y'all did a great job of quoting Psalms 23, we're less familiar with the psalm that comes right in front of it, Psalms 22. Psalms 22, the initial words of Psalms 22 are, my God, why have you forsaken me? I absolutely believe that was code that Jesus used on the cross to explain his position that is just as firm and resolute and in some ways joyful of going to his death, knowing that it's what God intended. Because when you look back at Psalms 22, here's some of the phrases that you find in that a Jewish person would have memorized that song. Again, there's only 150 psalms. They know those psalms by heart. They know what those words mean. They can quote them from memory. And so Jesus used code, and both Matthew and Mark, as they're writing to their Jewish friends, use that same code to remind them of something they were very familiar with, and that's Psalms 22. Because it starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me? By the time you get down to verse 5, it's, in you they trusted and were not disappointed, talking about our forefathers in the Jewish history. Verse 7, they hurl insults at me. Verse 17, I am poured out like water, and my bones are out of joint, as he's hanging from the cross. Verse 15, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. He's thirsty. You remember back over in John, that's one of the phrases that he uses, I am thirsty. Verse 16, they have pierced my hands and my feet. 18, they divide my garments and cast lots for my clothing. Now over back in John's gospel, John explains that in detail. Because Jesus was following the law every step of the way, the clothing that he had was made out of one garment. There were no seams in it. And so the soldiers, instead of ripping it apart and each one of them getting a piece of maybe of this Jesus fellow that they're crucifying, they decided, nope, winner take all. We don't want to tear up this marvelous single piece of clothing. It is worth a great deal. So we're going to throw dice to see who walks away from this with that piece of clothing. But that had been foretold millennia before, back in Psalms 22 when it's written. Verse 22 begins to come out as very strong and hopeful, and this is exactly what the plan has always been. I will declare your name to my brothers. Verse 24, for he has not despised and disdained the suffering of the afflicted one. Verse 31, the last verse. They will proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn. We weren't there when all this happened. Sean, that last slide. So here's the deal. Keeping things in context is not always easy, and especially if you read kind of briskly through it. Matthew and Mark give us hints about the context. They started out with an Aramaic phrase. They don't just tell you the translation. They are giving it to you in the written language, in the language that a Jewish person would have known that Psalms 22 by. The moment they hear that phrase, it's like the moment we hear a phrase like Amazing Grace. We know that song. We know what comes next. You've got to remember that they had a targeted readership. They were writing these letters, these gospels, to Jewish people who had a strong Jewish background. They knew others would read them, so they provide a translation for that Aramaic. But they are focusing on trying to get Jews to understand Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament completely. How many more things do you need from Psalms 22 to what occurred that day at the cross? By understanding that, it completely changes the context of that phrase, doesn't it? Instead of it being what so many sermons, so many people, so much of what we've heard all our lives, dealing with the pain and agony and the fact that Jesus had kind of given up and he's torn away from God. That's inconsistent from a phrase that, no, from this day forward, you're going to be with me in paradise. Because where does that imply Jesus is going? Paradise. He has a hopeful look forward past the cross when he makes that statement to the thief that's hanging there beside him. And we absolutely, because we simply pick it up and read it in English and presume the words mean what they mean in English, we read it out of context. When we read it as a statement of Jesus saying, I am defeated. I am being torn away from God. God himself has forsaken me. I believe that that phrase is absolutely the opposite of that. And in fact, it's not a new story. That when you look back at early church fathers and their referencing of these statements and what occurred on the cross, Jerome, who I have a great deal of respect for, because Jerome is a magnificent scholar, lived right before the year 400. Jerome spent years in Jerusalem finding the best Greek manuscripts he could find, because by that time, the Roman Empire has now taken over, and Latin is more the official language than Greek. And so Jerome recognizes there's the need for a good Latin scripture. And so he devotes years of his life to the study of the scriptures and reads as many of these Greek manuscripts as he can as he creates the Latin, the book we know as the Vulgate. Jerome, because he's not caught up with the same problem we have of reading it in English and suddenly thinking, oh, guys, Jesus is on the cross and he's saying God's forsaken him. No. Jerome, in fact, understood, as did many of his contemporaries and people who came before him in their writings. They understood and made reference to the fact that those words that we find of just the one sentence that we get from either Matthew or Mark is a reference back to Psalm 22. That in the last few hundred years, we've lost that. That because we have the advantage of a Bible in our own language, we begin to take things out of context. So it's just a word of caution that we have to pay attention. I can't help. I'll throw in some humor. That Princess Bride, you know, the bad guys there early on, I don't think that means what you think it means. There are times in the Bible where the vast majority of it is clear and laid out for us, and we can understand the big principles, and we're okay. But there are times where we begin to build a certain section of that puzzle as we put together our theology, where we absolutely will miss and go the opposite direction of what the text means unless we understand the context. And that's why we have to be very careful and very studious and pay attention and to question and to be like the Bereans, to check the scriptures and say, hey, does that match up? Does that part of the theology, the puzzle that that person's putting together, do I agree with that or not? That's what we have to do as modern Christians. And it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. Very few of us, I suspect, speak Aramaic. It is so easy to blow past that phrase, the fact that those two men used Aramaic. We merge Gospels together to come up with a general story. And so with all the other things that are said in the other Gospels, it's so easy to lose track of the fact that these two writers felt like they only needed to use one phrase in describing what Jesus said from the cross. Context is important, and I hope you keep that in mind.